last but not least, we are going to have an incredible conversation all about diversity, equity, inclusion. And I know there are quite a bit of you that have been on a journey when it comes to DEI and creating more inclusive spaces. I myself have done a lot of traveling over the last few years, delivering, speaking engagements about DEI and, what it means to be on a journey with DEI. And I said, for this session, I didn't want you guys to listen to me. I wanted to bring some real juice to the table. And I have the wonderful Jasmine Moses coming to us talking about all things anti-bias education. All right, I have to do my spiel because you guys need to be well aware of who we have that is coming to speak on the stage. So meet Dr. Jasmine Moses. She is the owner of Equity in Bloom, an initiative dedicated to empowering caregivers and educators to raise and teach the next generation through anti-bias and anti-racist practices. As an anti-bias early childhood educator, she provides resources, professional development, and support to help implement these essential practices in early childhood settings. With a background as an early childhood teacher and community worker, Dr. Moses is passionate about fostering justice and equity from a young age. Her work focuses on creating inclusive and respectful environments for all children and their families, ensuring that every child has an opportunity to thrive. Hello, Dr. Jasmine Moses. How are you today?
I am doing so great. How are you?
Good. I'm excited to talk to you, girl.
I'm excited to talk to you too. This summit has been phenomenal. I
Thank
was popping in and out today. It has been amazing. So I'm so excited to be here.
Oh, thank you so much. Definitely be sure to give a virtual round of applause to Jasmine. So I've got some questions for her that I'm gonna start asking. I want to definitely invite the audience. If you have any questions, please be sure to pop it in the chat, or even better, pop it in the Q&A session so we can be sure that we get your questions answered. Because I said, we're creating a toolbox essentially today and over the weekend, and this is a part of your toolbox. All right. First question for you, Jasmine, is can you share a little bit more about your journey in this field and how did you start and what shaped your approach to this important work?
Of course. So I always knew that I wanted to be a teacher and work with children. I remember being in kindergarten and knowing that I wanted to be just like my kindergarten teacher. So I followed that path and I went for my bachelor's degree in early childhood education. And that certified me, of course, to teach that pre-K through 3. I also think it's funny, and when I tell people this, they laugh because I never intended to go back to school. I wanted to be in a classroom for the rest of my life. I remember starting, and I got there and I was like, I'm just gonna be here. I'm gonna retire and it's gonna be amazing. Um, and that actually wasn't my path. So I had some great mentors along the way who said, don't stop there. I think I want you to continue learning. And we need your voice in high places. We need your voice in places where people are making the policy decisions. And so you have to continue to learn about these things, learn about the research and all of that. So while I taught preschool, I got my master's degree, and it was also in early childhood, but it focused on advocacy, leadership, and policy. And that's something that we don't necessarily focus on in early childhood education if we take that early childhood route to get us into the classroom. And so I had my eyes opened during that, and I learned a lot of new ways that I could lend my voice to the field. And so I left the classroom during COVID, and I moved back home. So it was kind of like an organic kind of shift. And I looked for other ways to still be within the early childhood field, and to still work with children and to still work with teachers. And so I became an administrator. And that, of course, changed my life in terms of the differences between being in the classroom and then now having multiple people who are looking to you for support. And then moving from center-based work into the community work. And so it's been a journey, I think is the best way. But I've been so grateful for it because I've been able to get so many different lenses within the early childhood field. I recently completed my doctorate in May of 2024, before, and my dissertation work, thank you, I'm still so excited about it. My dissertation work was focused actually on anti-bias education in early childhood spaces. And so what comes from this work? What are people looking for? What tools and support are folks looking for to implement this work? And that led me to begin my work on Instagram. It led me to begin my consulting work. And since then, I've been able to help and work with so many amazing people and organizations on their anti-bias and anti-racist journeys. And I'm just grateful to have the opportunity to have moments like this and to be able to connect with folks.
Oh, beautiful, beautiful. Congratulations again on
Thank
that.
you.
There's a lot of people out there that are doing this work in DEI and anti-racist, curriculum and education, but there's something about people that have been in the field working directly with children that have seen the inequities and things firsthand with their eyes, and going on to do the work. I think that's what made me
Yes.
super passionate about doing work and actually presenting and having conversations about DEI is being an educator. My experience being an educator, and things that I've seen and how I can equip educators to do better and to be on that journey, like you mentioned. All right. So, on the lens of diversity, equity, and inclusion, or EDI, because I know some people say EDI, DEI, in your experience, what are the most common gaps or missing links when it comes to diversity, equity, inclusion in early childhood classrooms?
Yeah, so I think one of the biggest things that I speak to people a lot about recently is that it's become more of a buzzword. So whatever you call it, whether it's justice work or whether it's equity work or whether it's DEI, right? It has become a buzzword. It's talked about a lot, but there's not very much action that's put behind it. And what I've seen is that people are treating it like a box to just check off, right? Like I put up a poster or I got this diverse book and I put it in my library. So now I am a social justice expert, right? So I've been seeing a lot of that. And I want to just take every single space that I'm able to be in and tell people it's not something that you can just fix with a band-aid. And if you feel like it is, you're not doing it correctly, right? I think what you said before about being on a journey is it's so important to recognize that you never fully become a full expert on these practices. And if someone tells you that they know every single thing that there is to know about anything, you need to look for someone else to work with because that means that that person is not considering themselves a lifelong learner, right? And as early childhood educators, as practitioners, everything is an ongoing. I see somebody putting in the chat. Yes, it is an ongoing journey. You always have something to learn. And for me, that's honestly one of the best parts, right? It's always something new. Even in these spaces, people ask a question and I'm like, I never thought about it that way, right? And so there's always something new to learn. So I think that's the biggest one. Um, Another issue is that it's very surface level, right? And so we see some of these initiatives being brought out around DEI and materials, and they're not necessarily digging deeper into those systems. And we are all a part of the systems. They make up how we operate no matter where we are. And we can see a lot of that surface level happening when new administrations come in or when new policies come out. And the first thing to go are the DEI programs that people work so hard to implement, right? That's how I know that some of these practices are surface level. And we can see that throughout, not just in early childhood, but in other spaces too. Um, I think too, and this is a space where I feel like I can be very real here, right?
Yeah, safe
So,
space. No judgment, no judgment.
safe
What do they say
space.
again? This is a no judgment, safe space. Yeah.
Okay, no judgment, right? I think that a lot of times people are trying to come from a place of talking about DEI or bias, and they haven't taken the time to think through and reflect for themselves.
Mhm.
And I heard someone say earlier, I think multiple times, but you can't teach someone something that you're not willing to do. And so I think that's a gap for me, right? And that goes back to that learning piece. If you are not willing to take the time to, I see a 100 going up in the chat. If you are not willing to take the time to learn with your staff, if you are not willing to take the time to unpack your biases before coming into the classroom or while in the classroom, working with these children and working with their families, right? How can you tell them that that it's so important? So I think those are some of the things that are, some of the gaps that I've been seeing recently. And I know we'll get into some of like the concerns or the fears as we move through, but that is some of the things. And one of the things I want to reiterate to you all is that diversity work is it's a privilege if you don't care about it or if you choose to not talk about it. For people who have these experiences all the time, and for people who are living their lives out of that dominant narrative, it's not just something we can turn off, right? And so it's our lived realities every single day. And so if you're saying that doesn't matter to me, or I have children who it doesn't matter, they can talk about that later, that's a privilege to even be able to say that, right? Because a lot of classrooms and spaces and schools and industries are not able to do that. So that those are a couple of the things that, I've been seeing in the missing links. And what I want to also reiterate too is that these are all things that can be worked on. None of this is something that makes it too far out of the realm or too messed up or too far away to connect with and to fix, right? And to continuously work on.
Oh, that is so wonderful. And I think the question and talking about the gaps is so important because I think it's great to acknowledge that there are gaps,
Yes.
and
Yes.
that there's opportunities to close that gaps in the work that we do. So that is awesome stuff. All right, so tell me a little bit about your inspiration. What inspired you to focus on anti-bias and anti-racism work in early education? And was there a particular moment or experience that ignited your passion?
It wasn't just one moment for me. I think it was a series of experiences. So, as a Black woman, right, I've seen how early children they start to be treated differently because of race, class, ability, whatever. And so, when I became an educator, I noticed that these patterns were repeated not just in classrooms, but like we talked about, those systems, right? And when we're taking a further look into equity work and anti racism and anti bias work, and DEI as a whole, we have to look at our policies and practices that we have happening. What paperwork are you sending out to your families? Is it accessible? What events are you having in your school? Are you marginalizing one group of folks or only catering to one group of folks, right? So there's so many different ways to look at this. And then also going through an early childhood educator program where I was the only person of color in actually all of my blocks, right? And so that I think opened my eyes to a lot of the ways that we're thinking about DEI and equity and justice, even in our teacher preparation programs. And so if you are not talking about those things when you're learning to become a teacher, where are you talking about those things at? So I think that's an inspiration for me too, because in early childhood, there's so many different, and it's a unique field, right? And a beautiful field. And there's so many different ways to become an early childhood educator. And so if you are not in all those different avenues, if you are not talking about why it's important to welcome everyone, why it's important to create inclusive spaces, when are you going to talk about them? Because 9 times out of 10, you're not maybe working in a space where it's even acceptable to talk about. So that I think is that's why I chose to focus on it. I started my master's program and worked a lot on the brilliance of Black boys and the ways that the system already labels children even before they get to show us who they are. And that's
Yeah.
that systems. Those are those systems that are working, right? And so I just know from my child development background and from working with children how curious and how open they are. And a lot of times, adults are the ones that are passing down these biases. And
Yeah.
there's opportunity that lies in being able to help children and their families understand fairness, justice, equity, and to answer their questions right from the beginning. And so I think that's a lot of my inspiration right there is that there are literal lives on the line. There
Mhm,
are. And so we have to make sure that we are making these changes, making these adjustments, because if not, we're not doing our jobs as early childhood educators. And I don't know about anyone else, but I made a commitment when I became an early childhood educator to service all families.
mhm,
And so we need to make sure that we are instilling these practices and making the commitment to learning and doing this work at all times.
mhm. Ooh, what a mic drop. Yep. If you're in this work, we're talking about all families. We're not talking about a
Yeah.
percentage. We're talking
Yeah.
about every single family that comes down our path. And, I
Yes.
love hearing what your why is. And when I do, there's a specific conversation that I do with DEI in my workshops. And I actually get the crowd to do a little bit of self work on reflecting what their why is. As we know, we're motivated by the things that trigger us and the experiences that we go through. So there's always a why. There's a why you became an early childhood educator. There's a why for the things that you do, but there's also a why behind your work with DEI in
Yeah.
the classroom. There's either a moment you have experienced yourself or a moment that you've seen another child experience or a family experience that motivates it. So I really do challenge everybody in the chat now, like to do a little bit of self-reflection on your own time, doesn't have to be now, on what your why is. If you're
Mhm.
have this mission and you have this feeling of wanting to really, really work on DEI this year, I want you to start with thinking, what is your why? Because your why is going to be the exact moment and the exact thing that will help you carry out this work, because it's not going to be easy work. There's going to be a whole lot of understanding, a whole lot of mishaps. I always talk about the uh-ohs that we do when we miss the mark on certain things and
Mhm.
certain aspects. But what's going to keep us going is our why. So definitely think about that. So thank you for sharing your why for sure.
Yeah, thank
So
you.
what are some of the biggest challenges you have faced in your efforts to bring anti-bias and anti-racism education into early childhood settings?
Mm. I don't know if we have all day to sit and unpack some of these
Right?
things, but let's go through a couple of them. I think the first thing, and if you've seen some of my work on Instagram and you've worked with me before, you know that I talk a lot about the fear of discomfort
Yeah.
and how fear can halt us. It halts our progress, it halts our work, and sometimes people are too scared to even address their own biases or have those hard conversations with other adults and with children. They might worry about saying the wrong thing, so they say nothing at all, and then we get caught up in this cycle. And so I'm going to debunk a couple of things here for you. It is okay to say the wrong thing. You might
Mhm.
not have ever heard that before, but it is. It is really okay to say the wrong thing, right? When we all lead with kindness and respect, even if we're leading with those things, we still could misspeak, and that's okay, right? If you misspeak, or if you say something out of turn, or if something happens, I want you to just take a moment, recognize it, right? Call it out and say, I didn't mean this, or I should have said this. If an apology is needed to the children around you, to a teacher, to whoever, take the time to apologize, right? And then take the time to internalize the fact and say out loud that I am still learning. And so I am learning about this. And this was a great example for me to be able to take back and to continue to research and learn. Okay. So get out of that discomfort space, because if we stay in it, we will never get this work done. And there, once again, our lives on the line. So we have to keep going. Um, Surface level commitment we talked about for a little bit, but we sometimes say like we love all children, and I do believe that, right? If you're going into early childhood education, I do believe that you should love all children and their families, but what are you doing to dive deeper into this work, right? What are you doing to address those systems that we know that children are in? Like, what are you doing to do that type of work, right? So we got to take it from that surface level down further in. A lot of times when I go to PDs and I work with staffs, they're like, okay, well, what about families who don't actually agree with the work that we're doing? And there's this common misconception here that children are too young to understand bias and fairness and justice. And that leads to that resistance or that fear from caregivers and even colleagues. And I actually just made a reel about this yesterday. You cannot operate in this space saying that children are too young.
Mhm.
Children start noticing differences about 3 months old,
Yeah.
right? So they're able to notice those differences as a baby, as an infant, right? And so then we're going into the toddler years, into the preschool years. And if you've worked with children, you know children are not shy about spilling the tea about what's happening in their lives. And they are not shy about asking questions. And a lot of times when they ask those questions, we as adults, our first reaction is to just freeze because
Mhm.
we're taking our own adult process and the things that we've internalized and carried with us and taking it into that conversation, which rightfully so, right? But we have to take a look at what children are actually asking. And when we take a step back and think about the fact that children are really asking to understand, then it helps us operate differently, right? Even being in spaces where I've had children say, and at the time I was Miss Price, why is your skin so dark? Why is your skin brown? Why is it so dark? Because I have melanin in my skin and it changes the pigment of it,
Yeah.
right? Like, okay, like it's and they're like, okay. They just go on about
Yeah.
their day,
Yeah.
right? So it's just being able to have those conversations and take your emotional responses out of it so important. And I think that's how we can kind of combat that pushback from adults. And
Mhm.
then also a lack of accountability. Sometimes with like anti-racism and anti-bias work, everybody's like, okay, whose job is that?
Yeah.
Whose job is this? I've gone into spaces where they're like, okay, this is the person that's going to teach us about anti-bias and anti-racism. And I'm sure she'll stay connected with us when, she leaves. I was like, that is so true. I always love to stay connected with the people that I work with, but I also want to know, what are you doing to keep up these
Doing, yeah.
practices while I'm gone,
Right.
right?
Yes.
This cannot just be a one in every couple years situation where you bring in someone who's focused on this and that's the only time you talk about it. I'm
Yeah.
leaving you with some steps to implement with your families, some things to look at within your policies, and some things to look at within your classrooms. So let's make an action plan. And that's
Mhm.
something that I always like to do when I work with schools, when I work with teachers, when I work with parents on their own. What does your action plan look like? I want
Mhm.
you to take a couple of things that you heard here today and
Mhm.
find a time to implement it. One, I want you to implement on Monday, right? But we're gonna take one thing and bring it into your classroom and bring it into your space on Monday. But the other ones, create a timeline because
Yes.
you have to be able to work through these things and to process it because it's everybody's job. It's not just the person who's focused on justice or equity or diversity. It is everyone's job to make our world more equitable and to make these spaces more welcoming for all of our families and children. So
Yeah.
those I think are a few of the biggest challenges that I face. Also, of course, we know policies changing, people who are, nervous about having these conversations are now in power and making decisions for people who are in the classroom and they've seen the work. So I think that's always a challenge, but the ways that we can combat a lot of these challenges that we are experiencing is leading into community,
Yeah.
building a network around you, and a space for you to bounce ideas off, a space for you to connect, a space for you to release your worries. So I want to make sure that folks know you need people, right? You need people who are focused around the same types of work that you're doing and who can continue to push you even when you feel like it's hopeless or nobody's listening. That's when you really root into your community. And that for the last few months, I've been rooting into my community so heavy because
Mhm.
if not, you can get these feelings of hopelessness. And that's not what our children need, right?
Yeah.
They need us to be able to be resilient, just like they are. Children are the most resilient
Brilliant.
population.
Yes.
And
Yeah.
so we need to take a point from them and bring into that resilience, even when it's a struggle to be able to implement this work, even if you get pushback, even if your teachers or your administrators don't support you.
Mhm.
You have to be able to lean into your community that you've built outside and continue to push on because it's so important.
Mhm. So important. Wow. So well said. And I'm seeing all the comments in the chat. Everybody's getting to the reflection side. And that's really
Mhm.
the biggest thing for me in having this conversation. It's not necessarily to do an introductory conversation on what DEI is. It's about let's reflect on what's happening now. And I'll totally be vulnerable right now. When I started my work with presenting and doing workshops with DEI, I burnt out. I burnt out really easily, where I actually didn't feel like talking about it anymore. And it's because I found a lot of the conversations I was having with certain communities, it was around the introductory part of DEI, which is very, very important. But I also realized the trend of a lot of us taking introductory conversations to not go into the deeper part of what it is. So we keep doing the introductory, what DEI is and all that stuff. We don't get into the deeper of it because we're scared of what's there. And
Mhm.
I really reframed a lot of the workshops that I did to being less conversations of the introductory parts of DEI, but let's put some action. And I love that you mentioned that. Let's put some action. Let's put some things into place, because that's where we're going to see the magic and the change that we want to see happen, is behind our action and what that means for us. So I'm happy you mentioned that, because it's so, so true.
Mhm.
All right, so we talked about the biggest challenges. Let's move into rewarding moments. Can you share a rewarding moment or a success story from your work that affirmed the importance of what you do?
I think it's all rewarding. I think one of the best parts, and I just mentioned a little bit, is building a community of folks who get it. So I started my little tiny Instagram account thinking like, and I remember having these conversations with my husband and my best friend. I'm like, I'm gonna take what I've learned and what is the research, and I'm just gonna put it on Instagram.
Yeah.
And maybe there are people out there who also love this and who will connect with me. And they're
Yes.
like, okay, like try it out. Sure, you can do it. And so, one of the best parts are the messages that I get in my DMs from people who have seen some of the things that I do and who have implemented it. Or I posted a book that I read, and so they read it and they tell me about how it's changed their practice. Seeing educators, caregivers, and other people in the community come together who are committed to raising thoughtful, equity centered children and who are socially conscious. And I think that reminds me of why my work is so needed and why it matters so much. And then, of course, when someone tells me that they went back into their classroom and they had a real conversation with their families, or they had a conversation with their children in their classroom, and instead of freezing up, they were able to navigate it, or even they were able to say, you know what, I don't know everything and I'm open to learning. That's rewarding for me too. And they were able to say that with children. They were
Yes.
able to be vulnerable with their children. And that's
Yes.
one of the things that every time I go into a space, I'm like, you can tell children you don't know something. And
Yes.
people are like, no, you can't. And I'm like, you can. I've done it. I've lived to tell the tale. And so they love hearing that adults are still learning too, right? And then it takes away from this supremacy culture that we've built and that we live in, that we all have to know everything. And if you mess up, it's wrong and all of that. It takes away the pressure of that, right? And so I think that's some of the beautiful moments that I have in the rewarding moments. It's just people being successful on their own. And sometimes success might not look like whole program shifting or whole cities making a change. Sometimes success looks like you trying something out and being successful at it. One person, right? And that to me is a success. So every time someone sends me a DM or an email or whatever, I praise them and we have this conversation because I'm very excited that you even are on this journey with me and that we're able to connect and learn. So those I think are the rewarding moments. And every time I get to go to a space where I get to teach or talk or connect, I'm just grateful for the opportunity to be able to do so. So yeah, I think that's what's continuously pushing me forward is that there are people out here who feel the same way about this work that I do. And I have to meet you all. That's my goal. I got to meet everybody who's committed to this work too. Because our children, like they need it. They need it. And so do we as adults. Like we spend a lot of time talking. This is a whole nother tangent. So if you've seen some of my work on Instagram, but we spend a lot of time talking about like we need to teach children this. We need to teach them all of these things and like pour all this knowledge out. But I need some adults to take some of the things that they're trying to teach children and teach themselves and the people around them, right? Because sometimes adults are the biggest resistors to a lot of this. So
Yes.
those are some of my rewarding moments. It's just people kind of humbling themselves to be open enough to learn and to grow.
Yes. Oh, beautiful, beautiful. Yeah, those moments are really, really special when, and like you said, in this work, it's just about your impact. And your impact could be, like you said, one person, it could be a full room, it could be one child. But when you focus on your impact, that's where you're going to really have those success moments. And that's what makes it so rewarding. I love that. All right, so let's talk about inclusive classrooms. So I know a lot of people are on the mission to build more inclusive classrooms. So what
Yeah.
does an inclusive classroom look like in terms of curriculum, environment, and interactions, especially for young learners?
Yeah, so I think there is no one size fits all. So I would like to start there, because if your classroom is truly diverse and inclusive, it's incorporating backgrounds for people who are in your space or the world around you. So there's no one size fits all. But I want you to take a look at your first and foremost curriculum, and I want you to make sure that it centers diverse perspectives and voices and that it challenges those dominant narratives that we've always been led to believe. So, whose stories are being told? What are we learning about them? How can we continue to incorporate that work? Also, including stories of maybe activists or communities who are often left out of traditional lessons. And when I say that, I mean our society has built a lot of worth around one person accomplishing all the things.
Mhm.
And we take that when we do things like that, it takes away from the fact that we need community to survive. And a lot of times it takes a lot of think partners to be able to make new changes and make things work. And so I want you to think about what your curriculum centers, and if it centers the fact that we all work together and we're all a part of this classroom community together.
Mhm.
I also want you to think about if your curriculum is encouraging critical thinking.
Mhm.
Are there spaces for children to ask these open-ended questions, right? I saw someone put in the chat, children love feeling like they taught you something. That is very true. And so are there spaces for them to be able to share things and to share their perspectives? Are families able to be incorporated into this work? I also want to take some time to think about the books, right, that you're reading with children. That's one of my favorite things are children's books. So if you get to know me, you know that. But are you choosing books that feature diverse characters, from diverse racial backgrounds, cultural backgrounds, linguistic backgrounds, ability backgrounds, etc.? Are you choosing those? And even in stories that don't necessarily focus on justice or anti-racism, right? Are you choosing books that in our everyday stories feature the diverse illustrations and inclusive spaces that we see when we go outside or when we see in our community? So are you strategically choosing those? Toys and play materials. So making sure that we are offering that representation that we have. Dolls maybe with varying skin tones and body types and abilities, and including some non-gendered toys that encourage all children to explore a variety of roles and activities. And then, of course, providing more materials that reflect the real world around children and where they can learn and incorporate those things. And then also, when we think about toys and materials, not limiting children to what they can play with and those spaces that they can play in. I think that now that's a deeper conversation, but that's kind of going into those systems and things. If we're making inclusive spaces and classrooms for our children, that's one of the things that we need to talk about and continue to keep at the forefront. And then, of course, what posters, what pictures, what does your classroom look like? What's on your walls? So I hope you're highlighting themes of community. I hope you're highlighting things of collaboration, affirming messages. Maybe those messages are in multiple languages. Maybe they feature people from different racial and cultural backgrounds. It can get down to art supplies. It can get down to accessibility and tools and making sure that you have sensory tools or even large print materials to ensure that all children can participate. Take a look at your environment. So what materials and resources, what are they reflecting? Ensure accessibility for children and adaptable spaces and tools, and then interactions too. So making sure that you are having these conversations, and if harm happens in your classroom in any given form, that you're taking the time to invite, to call people in and to reflect and repair, and all of those practices. I think it's not just about the curriculum that we pass out to children. It should be embedded into every single thing that we do.
Oh yes, absolutely. One of the things I always mention in my tips in my one of my workshops is looking at curriculum, but then also looking at the whole program as a whole in the sense of your
Yes.
vision, your mission statement, your
Yes.
philosophy. If your if diversity, equity, inclusion doesn't show up in those aspects, all of the activities, all of the program plans, they fall in line with what those are. So you've got to take it all the way back in terms of
Yes.
how you do things. So I love the examples you gave. And I'm seeing in the chat and also in the question and answer box, actually, the next question I have connects to all of those. So let's talk
Mhm.
more about the resources and what resources. I know you mentioned quite a bit in your answer there, which is great. But the next question I have is, you developed a range of resources and tools for educators. How do you go about creating material that is accessible, impactful, and age appropriate for young children? So, like for the educators, how do they go about creating their own things for the classrooms that are age appropriate and highlighting all those aspects?
Yeah, so I think you first and foremost have to lean into the fact that you are an early childhood educator. You are an expert in child development, and you are an expert in the work that you're doing with your children and families, right? So start there, lean into that. And then also, I think a lot of these topics can be broken down into digestible ways for children. So if you're thinking about things that you want to incorporate or big topics, a lot of times these happen with conversations, right? So being able to support children as they're thinking through and processing. A lot of my like social justice and anti-bias and anti-racism, a lot of those conversations happen during like our morning meeting time or when we were reading books with children and a question came up, right? So being prepared to have those conversations with children, and I think it just kind of goes back to what you're incorporating in your classroom and the type of work and the type of materials that you're putting out, right? Because if children have questions, they will ask. So making sure that we're incorporating those materials and that they have them. For me, I always make sure that I prioritize staying connected with folks who are doing the work, right? So I'm following social media pages if I'm interested in activism and anti-bias work and anti-racism work and how I can incorporate that in the classroom. I'm looking for resources online. I'm reading additional reading in books about what this work looks like and then implementing some of the things into the work. And like I said, lean into your background of being able to talk about a whole host of things with children. If you are able to break down concepts with children like body safety, and like stranger safety and things like that, you are able to have these conversations with children and break them down into open and honest ways. And if you feel like you don't know it all or that you need additional support, you are also able to tell children, I'm not sure. Let's look this up together. And now we have that emergent curriculum happening, right? We're able to go and we're able to take some of the things that we talked about, research them, and now we can study them in our classes with our children together. So I think those are a few of the ways that you can develop these things. And another thing that working with educators through like my dissertation work, people are looking for bite-sized ways to incorporate this into their practice, which is fair because as early childhood educators, you do not have a lot of time for additional reading sometimes or long series of things. So when I'm creating resources for my families or when I'm creating resources for teachers, and then when I created resources for children, I always prioritize taking what I wanted to say and then breaking it down into bullets or chunks to make sure that like it's easy to digest, easy to navigate, and just more accessible for all parties involved.
Mhm. Beautifully said, beautifully said. So lots of information. And I love how you said, I love everything that you're saying, but I love how you said, like, we have the power. We have the power. Yes, we may need additional information on how to support DEI in certain spaces. And there's some questions we can't necessarily answer on the ball because that's not from our world and we're learning, but we have the tools already to create experiences for children. We already have that.
Mhm.
We have that, right? So just leaning into our superpower as early childhood educators in creating experiences for children, but just adding the DEI stuff to it as well. Adding that to the equation is really important. So loving the comments I'm seeing here. Okay, so you did mention a little bit about, biases and all of those aspects. And I know that that can happen a lot in the classroom, and
Mhm.
sometimes at a moment for a lot of educators are like, whoa, like did that just get said? Or like, you
Mhm.
probably heard that at home, but I know that's not you. And sometimes those situations happen right in front of your eyes. So what are some specific tools or strategies that early childhood educators can use to help children begin to recognize and challenge biases in age appropriate ways?
Yeah, so I think, of course, we talked about materials that go beyond just the basics. I even saw someone put in the chat that like putting out a diverse book, which I do love, hair love, but putting out a book does not make you an inclusive space. And that person is completely right. So we're going beyond, that surface level piece and challenging the usual narratives and stories that we as a society often like to prioritize. So I think that's the first thing. I also want you to take some time and help children question rules and power. Right. So when we start to think about systems, rules don't just appear out of nowhere. They're created by people and they don't always work for everyone. So if we're thinking about inclusive spaces and making sure that everyone is a part of the community, I want you to think of classroom rules and agreements in that way too. So, who made this rule? Is it fair? Is it accessible for all people? Does it help everyone? Those are some of the things that we can start to break down and have conversations with children about. And so that's when we have the theme of kind of going deeper within, this type of focus. That's when justice starts to happen, right? When we can come together and say, "Hey, this rule is actually not fair for so and so in our classroom. What if we changed it? What if it looked differently? And what if this policy looked differently?" Right? So being able to have those conversations. I also want you to continue to involve families in your work. Bias does not just stop at the classroom door, and children are not just shaped by their classroom teacher. They are shaped by everything that's happening around them, including their families. So, families are not an opponent. Sometimes when I go into spaces, people talk about families as if they are not on the same team, and we're all on the same team. And so, it's families and educators, and then we're children too, right? All three of us kind of working together to be more successful in our work. And so I want you to think about that. Share resources with your families. Share conversation starters. When I was in the classroom, I would talk a lot about a lot of these things, but then I would say, okay, we talked about some heavy stuff in the classroom. So in my message to the parents at the end of the day, I said, hey, this came up in our classroom today. Here's how I addressed it. And here's some things that you can do at home to keep the conversation going. And since we are same team, I am here to assist. If this, makes you nervous or if you need additional resources, I've got you. Let's talk. And that's how you can head off some of this stuff too, or some of the trickiness with families, right? A lot of times and I actually remember one time, I think it was my first year teaching. It actually was my first year teaching. And I'm sitting in morning meeting and, we're doing the songs. That's one of my favorite part of being with children, doing the songs, we're having conversations. I remember one of my parents walked in during morning meeting and pulled me out of morning meeting and said she needed to talk to me.
Oh,
But
okay.
first year
We're doing anything
teacher, first year teacher, I'm like, okay, sure. And so we're in my office. She pulled me into my office and she's like, I cannot believe that you would sit and have a conversation with my child about blah 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 blah. And I'm just like, okay, but at the time, I didn't understand the fact that, like, she was coming from a place of fear, right, and concern because it's something that made her anxious. And so
Mhm.
after we got through it, we emailed a little bit back and forth. I just kind of told her, like, I asked her, like, what's making you so upset? Because you were visibly upset. What's making you so upset so I can try to understand? And she's like, well, we don't talk about this in my family. I don't know how to approach this with children. And I'm like, oh, so you need resources.
Mm,
Great, let's talk about it. And so that for me, I think was a pivotal moment where I began to understand that a lot of times people fear manifests itself as anger, or other like harsh emotions, right, that we see. And so that was, I tell that story often because I want to let people understand that like sometimes parents really just don't know, and the fear or the anger that you see is just, it's fear being masked. So making sure that you're talking with them and you're sharing those resources, and that's a great way to do that. And talk about those shared values. And I also want to let people know too that like a lot of times when families are coming in, they should already know that you prioritize diversity, anti-bias, and anti-racism, and all of the above in your classroom and in your policies. So when you signed up for this program, right, and that's going into those systems, when you signed up for this program, when you came into this classroom, you saw this sign on the door that says all are welcome here. And I meant that.
That's everybody.
I mean that, right? I don't just say it.
Yeah.
So it's, I think letting families know that too, that like these are our core values. This is what we believe, and this is what we practice here. And then also modeling and practicing critical thinking. And in this day and age, with everything that's happening in this world, we need more critical thinkers. So making sure that we are modeling those things for children, asking them those open-ended questions, having these conversations, and just making sure that we're open to responding to them into ways that's appropriate, I think is so important as well.
Wow. Beautiful, beautiful stuff. You know what? I'm super sad because we're like at the end. Yeah, we're at listen, I can talk to you all day about this because this is a well needed topic. But I know that there's going to be a portion of people that said, I just need more of Dr. Jasmine. So I need more of her. So please just let everybody know, what you have to offer, a little bit more about where they can find you, work with you, and all of that great stuff. I want to give you a chance because I know people are going to be following.
Yeah. 30 seconds to just kind of give them a tangible takeaway. So a lot of times when we are nervous about incorporating this work into our classrooms, it can, like fear, it can halt us. So I want you to think about a table, right? And so the tabletop of a table represents what you're doing in your classroom, the ways that you're incorporating these practices, this anti-bias work, this anti-racist work there, right? And so then your table needs legs to be able to stand. So I want you to think about why you're doing this work. What outcomes are you hoping for? How it connects to whatever standards or whatever policies you have, whether it's in your state, whether it's in your community, whether it's in your curriculum, and make sure that it aligns with your goals too. Because a lot of times when your administrator is coming in or when families are coming in, you need a table to be able to stand on, to be able to say, like, this is why we're doing this work in our space, and this is why it's so important. So, and of course, I love to keep the conversation going. Um, Please find me over on Instagram at the Anti-Bias ECE, and you'll see a lot of that work happening too. I also put together a book list of over 100 diverse and inclusive children's books. There's also some books on it for adults too. So if you are going and heading over to my Instagram or to the website, you can download that. For people who had further questions about, okay, I love the books, but what else, what am I doing beyond putting those books out? I also created something that I'm very passionate about called Little Sprouts of Equity. And it's where you find community, to where you are able to take these picture book guides that I give you a whole lesson plan of how to implement this work, whether it's in your classroom or at home with your children. And so it's a whole program that I'm really, really excited about. So that's all on my website too. And then the most exciting thing, if you can't tell, I'm very excited, is that I just launched my trailer for my very new podcast. Okay, y'all, it's hot off the press. It is called Children Deserve Better. And we are going to dive into a lot of what is happening in the world and how we can take it and apply it. And I'm going to line up some amazing guests so that they can let you know what this work looks like. And it's just prioritizing the fact that anti-racism, anti-bias, DEI is for everyone. But action looks different for everybody, and I recognize that. So I'm making sure that this is a space where you can find different ways to take action. So yes, please chat. I love to keep the conversation going. And yeah, thank you so much for welcoming me here.
Oh, it was such a pleasure. Listen, can you share that cup? I need to see that cup. Yeah. Yeah.
So
Show
it
that.
says
Yeah. That's
Dr. Jasmine
yeah.
Moses, and then on the back it says it's doctor actually.
Yes, I love that. Listen, I saw you take a sip. I'm like, yeah, that's right. That's right. It's Dr. Jasmine Moses. Jasmine, thank you so much for
Thank you for
spending
having
the
me.
day with us. I think that this was such a critical conversation to have. I know, a lot of the conversations I'm having with ECEs, they're ready for this journey and
Yeah.
they're ready to take action. And I think
Yeah.
the more people that we have, that are up to bat, that is willing to have this conversation, like you and I, the more action we'll see. So I want to say thank you
Yeah.
so much for joining us.
Yeah. Thank you so much for having me. Thank you to everyone who's listening.